Charleston, South Carolina, late summer of 2012. The old Whitaker home on King Street stood silent for the first time in decades. The ceiling fans turned slowly, stirring the warm southern air, while dust motes floated like suspended memories through beams of sunlight falling across the hardwood floors. Helen Whitaker had passed away 3 weeks earlier, and now her grandson, Paul, was left with the quiet task of sorting through the house she had filled with quiet dignity, and, as he would soon learn, carefully kept secrets. Paul had always known his grandmother as a reserved woman, graceful, kind, but distant when it came to personal stories. She never spoke of her younger years. Born in 1923, Helen had lived through the Great Depression, World War II, and the Civil Rights Movement. She raised her children alone after her husband died in the 1960s, working as a librarian, baking cornbread every Sunday, and singing softly while folding laundry. She was the kind of woman who knew when to speak and when to remain silent. It was in the upstairs guest room, inside a weathered cedar chest lined with old linens, that Paul found the photograph. It had been tucked between the pages of a pocket-sized prayer book, the kind soldiers used to carry in their uniforms. The black and white image, slightly curled at the edges, showed a younger Helen, maybe in her early 20s, smiling softly as she stood arm in arm with a man in uniform. The soldier wasn't Paul's grandfather. That, he knew immediately. The man had the unmistakable stance of a U.S. Army infantryman, but there was something different about his expression. A quiet confidence, a gentleness in his eyes that contradicted the starched lines of his uniform. On the back of the photo, in Helen's tidy cursive, was written, July 1944, Marseille. Paul stared at the photograph for a long time, feeling like the floor beneath him had subtly shifted. Marseille. His grandmother had never even mentioned traveling to Europe. Why had she hidden this photo away? And who was the man standing beside her, close enough to hold, distant enough to vanish from family history? He brought the photo downstairs and showed it to his mother. She narrowed her eyes and slowly shook her head. "That's not your granddad. I don't know who that is," she said, handing it back. It should have ended there. Another family curiosity, quickly folded back into silence, but something in the soldier's gaze held Paul fast, like a whispered promise that there was more to the story. Much more. He didn't know it yet, but that single photograph, faded, forgotten, and almost lost, would unravel a hidden chapter of his grandmother's life, one filled with love, courage, wartime resistance, and the kind of sacrifice that never makes it into history books. It would lead Paul from dusty closets in Charleston to military records in Washington, from a quiet cemetery in Virginia to the vineyards of southern France, and finally to a truth that had been waiting for decades to be found. If this story touches you the way it touched me while writing it, leave a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share real stories that move, inspire, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what comes next will change everything. Helen Whitaker was the kind of woman who seemed born to carry things, groceries, books, burdens. She wore her silence like a shawl, wrapping it tightly around her shoulders, not as a barrier, but as protection for herself and maybe for others. To her grandchildren, she was steady and dependable, the one who always sent handwritten birthday cards, who baked sweet potato pie for every holiday, and who hummed hymns while folding laundry in the early afternoon light. But she never talked about the war. To most, that wasn't unusual. People from her generation often left the past where it belonged, behind them. But with Helen, there was something different. When World War II came up in conversation, even in passing, her eyes would drop ever so slightly. She would pause, sometimes mid-sentence, then offer a soft, immovable smile. "Some things," she once told Paul when he was 16, "aren't meant to be remembered out loud." He hadn't understood what she meant at the time. Now, as he held the photograph of her and the unknown soldier, he began to. Helen had been widowed in 1963. Her husband, Walter Whitaker, Paul's grandfather, had died of a heart attack in his sleep. She'd never remarried. When asked why, she would just say, "One love was enough." At the time, everyone assumed she meant Walter. No one had reason to think otherwise. But now, Paul couldn't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, that wasn't the whole truth. In the weeks following the discovery of the photograph, Paul couldn't shake the feeling that something important had been left unsaid. He returned to the house on King Street again and again, sorting through drawers, closets, attic boxes. There were letters from the 1950s, tax returns, old calendars, a collection of postcards from New Orleans, but nothing that mentioned France, nothing that hinted at another man. What disturbed him most was how carefully the photo had been hidden, folded into a small linen pouch and placed inside a prayer book she rarely used. It hadn't been meant to be found. That much was clear, but she hadn't destroyed it either. She'd kept it, right alongside scripture and pressed flowers from decades ago. That placement wasn't random. It meant something. Paul started asking questions. His mother, Helen's only daughter, had no answers. She remembered her mother occasionally speaking French under her breath when she was angry or tired, which she'd always assumed was just something Helen had picked up during her studies. She never talked about her life before meeting Dad, she said. Not because she was hiding anything, and I just think it hurt. That word stuck with Paul. Hurt. Could love hurt so deeply that someone would bury it for 70 years? He reached out to Helen's old church, St. Luke's Episcopal, where she had been active in the community since the 1940s. A kindly archivist offered to help him search through old bulletins and event programs. In one from 1946, Paul found Helen's name listed as a volunteer translator for war brides arriving in Charleston from Europe. It was a small detail, but it was something. He started going to the library, poring over records of American military presence in France during 1944. That's when he first read about the 36th Infantry Division, the Texas Division, which had landed in southern France in August of that year, pushing up through the Rhône Valley. They had worked closely with the French resistance. Some units had been in Marseille. It was the first time the place written on the back of the photo, Marseille, July 1944, came into sharper focus. Maybe Helen hadn't traveled to France after all. Maybe the man in the photo had come to her. Maybe they had met here, in Charleston, or somewhere nearby. And the photo was a memory of somewhere he'd been. Or perhaps she had been there as a volunteer, a nurse, or something else entirely. Each possibility opened a new question. Each question led him deeper into a past that was growing more real with every discovery. Paul began to feel that Helen's silence had been more than just personal. It had been sacred. He thought about the way she used to pause before grace, the long seconds of silence before the words came. Maybe she had been speaking to someone else too, someone no one else knew existed. And so, as summer gave way to fall, Paul found himself standing in two worlds. One was the Charleston he knew, old brick, slow afternoons, porch swings and Spanish moss. The other was the one he was slowly uncovering. Letters unsent, names unspoken, hearts unhealed, all because of one forgotten photograph. And he couldn't stop now. Paul had never been one to chase ghosts. He was rational, analytical, a software engineer by trade, not a romantic. But ever since he found that photograph of his grandmother Helen standing arm in arm with an unknown soldier, something in him had shifted. There was a presence in that image, a gravity he couldn't explain. The way the man looked at the camera, calm, steady, almost resigned, haunted him. He started by tracing the most obvious lead, the uniform. After comparing the buttons, the patches, and the insignia visible in the photo, he confirmed with near certainty that the man had served in the 36th Infantry Division, known as the Texas Division. Night. It was a unit composed largely of National Guardsmen from Texas and Oklahoma, and it had played a key role in the Allied invasion of southern France in 1944, particularly in the liberation of Marseille and the Rhône Valley. But what stood out most was this. Soldiers from the 36th weren't just fighters, they were also collaborators. Not in the sinister sense, but in cooperation with the French resistance. They had worked alongside local fighters, civilians, priests, teachers, anyone willing to stand against Nazi occupation. That put Helen's connection to the soldier in a new light. If she had volunteered in translation or aid work, which her church records seemed to suggest, perhaps that was how they met. Paul submitted a request to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., searching for service records of 36 Division soldiers stationed near Marseille in July 1944. The process took weeks. In the meantime, he contacted veterans associations, hoping someone might recognize the man from the photo. He received kind replies, condolences, and guesses, but no solid leads. Then one evening in early October, he received a file. It was digital, scanned in black and white, labeled Private First Class Samuel T. Hayes, born 1919, Austin, Texas, enlisted in 1942, assigned to the 141st Infantry Regiment, 36th Division, active in southern France in 1944, reported missing in action on August 10, 1944, during a mission near the town of Sisteron. No body recovered, no official burial. The personnel photo attached to the file was faded but unmistakable, the same gentle expression, the same deep-set eyes, the same slight dimple near the corner of his mouth. Paul sat back in his chair and stared. Samuel T. Hayes had a name, a history, and now, through Helen, a voice. But what had happened to him? The documents were sparse. A short commendation note spoke of his bravery. A letter from a fellow soldier mentioned him being sent out on a night patrol and never returning. No one saw him fall. No one could say where he went. One theory was that he'd been captured. Another, that he'd been killed in a forested ravine and left behind during retreat. In either case, he was gone. No family had claimed his effects. No next of kin listed. It was as if, after his disappearance, the world had moved on, and his memory faded with the ink, except in Helen. Now, Paul understood. Her silence wasn't just personal. It was protective. She hadn't lost a husband. She had lost a man the world forgot, and she had held on to him alone for nearly 70 years. Digging deeper, Paul found something else. A list from a chaplain's records, dated August 1944, mentioned a young woman from South Carolina named Whitaker, working with Allied intelligence. Her role was unofficial. She had translated intercepted messages, helped coordinate local guides in the Marseille region. The name wasn't followed up in any official record, just a passing mention. But it was enough. Helen had been there. She wasn't just waiting at home, she had gone. She had risked everything and met someone who would forever alter her path. Paul imagined their story, a war-torn city, a young woman translating for Allied officers, a soldier who spoke little but listened well, two people meeting in a moment neither could afford, and loving anyway. It wasn't fair. Samuel Hayes had died without a grave. Helen had lived with a wound she never revealed. And yet, here they were, side by side, in a photograph that had outlived them both. Paul printed the image again, this time in color. He placed it in a frame and set it on his desk. For the first time, the man in the photo wasn't a mystery. He was Samuel, a real person, a life not lost, but reclaimed. But now came the question. What to do with the truth? Should he tell his family, his mother? Would they understand? Would they see this as betrayal or revelation? Or should he do what Helen had done? Carry it silently, protectively? That decision, Paul knew, would not be easy. There are loves that roar into the world with fireworks and noise, and there are those that bloom in silence, in the spaces between fear and duty, like the one Paul was now beginning to uncover between his grandmother Helen and the soldier named Samuel Hayes. No one in the family had ever spoken of such a relationship. But the documents, the photo, and Helen's carefully guarded silence all pointed to something undeniable. This was not a passing acquaintance. It was love, real, impossible, and unfinished. In the back of one of Helen's old recipe books, Paul found a single page of lined paper folded twice, yellowed with time and fragile at the edges. On it, written in the same neat cursive as the note on the photo, were only a few lines. He asked me to wait. I said yes. Then the letters stopped. I waited anyway. Paul held the note in his hands like it was a relic. It wasn't dramatic. There were no flourishes, no declarations, just the quiet grief of someone who had lost something no one else ever knew existed. He couldn't stop picturing the two of them. Helen, just 21, working as a translator in Marseille. Samuel, 25, a soldier far from home, drawn to her because of her steadiness, her way of listening. Maybe they met over coffee in a makeshift Allied outpost. Maybe he helped her carry supplies down a muddy road. Or maybe they simply stood next to each other during a tense strategy meeting, and in that shared tension, something sparked. Whatever happened, it grew quickly. War has a way of compressing time. A day becomes a week becomes a lifetime. Emotions don't follow rules when the future is uncertain. Paul found more. In a small wooden box, tucked in the back of Helen's closet behind decades of winter coats, he discovered 3 photographs, all small, all worn. 2 showed Helen alone, one in uniform, one sitting beside a radio with a pencil in hand. The third was of Samuel, not in uniform, but in a white button-down shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, holding what looked like a letter. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't sad either. He looked aware, like someone who understood that he didn't have time to waste pretending. Behind the photo, another note, taken 2 days before he left. He said, "If I don't come back, don't wait too long." But I did. I always did. Paul could hardly breathe reading it. This wasn't just a summer romance. It wasn't even about war anymore. It was about 2 people who, in the middle of one of humanity's darkest chapters, found something luminous and had to let it go before it ever truly began. As he pieced the story together, Paul began to understand his grandmother's silences, the long pauses at the dinner table when someone mentioned the military, the way she avoided old war movies, the way she always lingered near the Veterans Memorial at church but never joined the services. It wasn't indifference, it was memory. She had mourned Samuel quietly, not with tears or tombstones, but by remembering him every day, through rituals, prayers, and keeping his picture safe. She had chosen to live a full life, to raise a family, to laugh again, but she had never replaced him in her heart. Walter Whitaker, her husband, had been a good man, kind, dependable, and perhaps Helen had loved him in her own way. But Paul now saw that her deepest bond had been with someone whose name no one knew until now, and that changed everything. Paul began writing down what he'd found, not just the facts, but the feelings. He wanted to honor their story, not as a tragedy, but as a quiet miracle, a reminder that even in war, even in chaos, people still found each other, even if only for a moment. He imagined the day Samuel left, August 8th, 1944, a humid morning. Helen at the train station. No kisses, no goodbye letters, just a look, a promise, and then silence. That's what hurt the most. Not the fact that they lost each other, but that Samuel died alone, without family, without anyone to claim his story, and that Helen had carried the memory alone for a lifetime, never speaking his name, never burdening anyone else with a grief that had no closure. Paul sat on his grandmother's front porch one evening, listening to cicadas hum in the dusk, thinking about how long this story had waited, how close it had come to being forgotten. If he hadn't opened that book, if he hadn't asked that question, the truth would have stayed buried. But now it wasn't, and love, once uncovered, deserves to be remembered. Paul sat alone in his grandmother's dining room, the late afternoon sun slanting through the shutters, casting long lines across the wood table where so many family meals had been shared. The room felt different now, not smaller, not colder, but heavier. Every object around him, the porcelain dish with chipped edges, the cross-stitch sampler that read "Bless this house," even the lace runner down the table center, seemed to whisper the same question. What are you going to do with the truth? He had the whole story now, or at least enough of it to understand the silence. Samuel T. Hayes wasn't just a name on a missing in action list. He had been someone Helen loved, deeply, fiercely, and in a way no one in the family had ever imagined. And Helen, for all her gentle quietness, had lived with the weight of that love for nearly 70 years. But now Paul had to decide, should he share what he had found? There was no playbook for this, no guide for unearthing a private history that had been so carefully buried. He considered telling his mother, Helen's daughter. She was a practical woman, grounded, proud of her southern roots, and the kind of mother who made sure the church casserole got delivered on time. Would she understand, or would she see this revelation as a betrayal? As if Helen's love for Samuel somehow made her marriage to Walter less true. Paul didn't think so, but he couldn't be sure. He knew how much people clung to the stories they'd always believed. To admit Helen had once loved someone else, someone who never made it home, someone whose name they'd never heard, might shift the entire foundation of how the family saw her. He thought of his cousins, of old photo albums where Helen and Walter were always pictured side by side, happy, it seemed, peaceful. But now Paul realized that even happiness could wear a veil. He began to write, not to confess, not to expose, but to remember. He wrote the story down as he had discovered it, gently, step by step. He avoided dramatics, stayed away from speculation. He told it plainly, what he'd found, what it likely meant, and how it had changed him. Then he printed it, just 3 copies. One for himself, one for his mother, and one he left at Helen's grave, folded and tucked into the earth beneath the bouquet of fresh wildflowers he placed every Sunday. He waited a week before giving it to his mother. No grand presentation, just an envelope on the kitchen counter with her name written on the front. She read it in silence. When she finished, she didn't speak right away. She just looked out the window, tears tracking slowly down her cheeks. Then finally she said, "She never said a word." Paul nodded. She didn't need to. His mother smiled, not the smile of someone amused, but of someone who had just been handed a puzzle piece that finally made the picture whole. "It makes sense now," she whispered, the way she'd stop in front of the war memorial. The way she'd get so still on certain days in July. I thought she was remembering Dad. There was no anger, no confusion, only a gentle sorrow and, perhaps even more, a quiet pride. They decided to share the story with the family, not as a revelation, but as a tribute. At the next family gathering, Paul read it aloud. There were a few gasps, some tears. But when he finished, the room was still, not tense, just reverent. Someone suggested they place a plaque in the garden Helen had kept for over 40 years, a small marker beneath the magnolia tree with Samuel's name and the words, "Loved and remembered in silence." Paul later spoke at a local veterans event that fall. He didn't give names. He didn't share photographs. But he told the story about a woman who waited without ever saying so, and about a man who vanished without ever being forgotten. After the event, an elderly veteran approached him. "Samuel T. Hayes," he said quietly. "I knew him, briefly. He was quiet but sharp. Smart kid. He had a girl. Wouldn't talk about her, but you could see it in his face. Always carried a folded note in his chest pocket. Must have read it 100 times. Paul's breath caught in his chest. For the first time, someone else had said his name aloud, and it felt like setting a stone down. A few months after the family gathering, Paul stood alone in a small veteran cemetery on the outskirts of Austin, Texas. The sky was pale and soft, a winter sun just beginning to dip below the horizon. The wind rustled through the trees with the same hush that had followed him ever since he first found that photograph. In his hands, he held a frame, the original black and white portrait of Helen Whitaker and Samuel T. Hayes. She was smiling. He was solemn, and together they were timeless. He knelt at the simple white marker bearing Samuel's name, placed only weeks before, after Paul petitioned the army to officially recognize his resting place as part of the memorial field for the missing. There was no body beneath it, only memory. But memory was enough now. Paul set the photograph down beside a small bronze plaque and placed a folded letter under a stone. On the outside it read, "You were never forgotten, not really. She remembered for both of you." He stayed there a while, not to grieve, but to feel connected. Helen had carried this story alone her entire life. She had kept it safe, like a sacred ember, not to protect herself, but to protect the memory of someone she had once dared to love in a world that didn't allow for such love to last. Back in Charleston, Paul made one final addition to the garden beneath the magnolia tree, a stone bench. On it, carved simply, "To those we remember in silence." No names, no dates, just space, for thought, for presence, for love. And in the years that followed, Paul shared the story more than once, at community events, at schools, in quiet conversations. He never dramatized it. He never used it for spectacle. But he told it because some truths matter not because they're grand, but because they were lived with grace. His grandmother's legacy was no longer just about sweet tea, Sunday hymns, and family dinners. It was also about resilience, about carrying deep, aching love with humility, about trusting that some things don't need to be spoken to be real. When people asked him why he had gone to such lengths to uncover a name, to follow a trail no one else had seen, he always gave the same answer: because she remembered. And now, I remember too. Love never lost, only waiting to be found. We share stories that heal and honor every single day. Stay with us and subscribe for more.